Okay, well, welcome everyone. Although I'm sure the majority of people in attendance this evening are RPI students and faculty. We may have guests from outside the Institute and maybe around the world. So I'll introduce myself. My name is Evan Douglas, and I'm the Dean of the School of Architecture at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And it is a great pleasure and honor to introduce tonight's speaker, the internationally renowned and celebrated artist, Sarah Oppenheimer. Recognized for her exquisitely designed and fabricated site-specific architectural installations, Oppenheimer's projects serve as spatial and perceptual actuators, revealing a magical hidden order residing below the surface in the world around us. Deeply invested in the Euclidean geometry as primal building blocks, perception as the basis of all human experience, and time-based kinetic architecture as an engine for radical spatial transformation, Oppenheimer's striking work calls attention to the power of art as a means to discover the other side of reality. Focused on seemingly simple set of iconic elements, such as doors, windows, columns, and beams, Oppenheimer has devised over the last 20 years an elaborate and highly sophisticated architectural syntax, enabling each of the built works to address issues of contested boundaries, privacy versus publicity, and the critical role of human engagement as an illuminating journey. Like a brilliant magician eluding any tracery of their technique, each of her projects are crafted with meticulous precision, requiring an extraordinary amount of conceptual and technical ingenuity behind the scenes. Although her monumental steel and glass pieces glide effortlessly through space and seemingly come together as a perfect assembly of parts, don't be deceived. Oppenheimer has invested years in the material and technological expertise necessary to sustain the exceedingly ambitious design nature of her work. Alain Robbe-Grillet, the great French writer and filmmaker, once said, and I quote, "The hallucinatory effect derives from the extraordinary clarity and not from the mystery or the mist. Nothing is more fantastic ultimately than precision." I can't think of a better description that captures the extraordinary rigor and profound attention to detail that underlies the brilliant ideas, the sublime design, and the flawless execution of her work. Oppenheimer received a BA in semiotics from Brown University, an MFA from Yale University, where she is currently a critic in the School of Art. Her work has been exhibited in Europe and in the United States at venues including the St. Louis Art Museum, the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Wexner Center for the Arts, the Museum of Contemporary Art in San Diego, and the Queens Museum of Art in New York, to name just a few. In recognition of her impressive career achievement, she has received numerous awards, including the prestigious Rome Prize, 2 New York Foundation for the Arts fellowships in architecture and environmental structures, the Louis Comfort Tiffany Foundation Fellowship, the American Academy of Arts and Letters Awards in Art, and the distinguished John Simon Guggenheim Memorial Foundation Fellowship. It is with great pleasure that I welcome Sarah Oppenheimer to RPI this evening. Sarah.
Thank you so much. That is a very generous introduction. I want to say, first of all, I'm incredibly happy to be joining this collection of people, although sadly remotely. And I would like to also note that I have collaboratively worked with several very significant individuals who are a part of the faculty there, who have really influenced both my thinking and actually the resultant work. So I would like to say a huge hello and thank you to Richard Jun-Yu and Joshua Draper, whom I adore. With that as a starting point, I also would like to say that there's something very striking about giving a talk in this current moment, in part because there are certain qualities of our dialogue and our collaboration, our sharing of this communication that are central to the way I consider and think about architecture and art, which is in some ways architecture serves as, and it opens the possibility of extending space, it opens the opportunity of extending conversation, and it opens the opportunity of extending collaboration. And in that sense, we can think of it not so much as a container or an object, but rather as an instrument by which and through which these exchanges occur. And in that sense, I would like to imagine the architecture of our present exchange as in keeping with the architecture that we may think of as a more material condition. And I will thereby jump into a discussion of all sorts of recent considerations. So just one moment as I navigate this new space. So just to confirm, are you seeing a cursor?
Yes, I am.
Okay, wonderful. So we influence our environment, and the environment influences us in turn. Let us imagine architecture as a bodily extension, a sensitive instrument bridging living selves. This is not a new idea. In 1969, which is now many decades past, Gordon Pask's thesis, The Architectural Relevance of Cybernetics, proposed a break from architecture's emphasis on temporal stasis and structural autonomy towards a theory of systemic mutualism, a time-based formative feedback loop between inhabitant and systems of habitation. The publication coincided with a celebration of interacting sensing environments, such as those seen in Joan Littlewood and Cedric Price's 1964 Fun Palace, and in Isazaki's 1968 Electric Labyrinth. The Contemporary Art Museum has embraced computer-controlled and electronically animated display space. The stretchable shell of the shed and the mobile platforms of foundation of the Galeries Lafayette herald an increasing technological mastery over mechanized, flexible space. However, a user's agency over their built environment remains highly constrained. My interest in feedback between building and body emerged from a different history. A pivoting door, a sliding window, a swinging gate, each accommodate and regulate human habitation, suggesting simple cybernetics that is shaped by the temporal and spatial scale of human gesture. Influenced by navigational studies of sociologist William White, in the early 2000s, I placed cameras throughout Lower Manhattan and began observation of patterns of pedestrian motion in processional space. These are a few of the slides taken at that time. I developed an experimental model to observe how changes in the dimension of architectural space impacted the path and gait of a user. In order to maintain dimensional and material uniformity between experiments, modular panels were fabricated. Panels were shipped to test sites and installed for experimental assay. My first experiments were conducted as follows. A set of test subjects entered a small room and were instructed to walk around this modular wall. Motion patterns were recorded on overhead cameras. Panel position was changed in response to collected data. A second set of subjects were then asked to repeat the task with the modular panels installed in a new configuration. Data between each trial was compared. One experiment was presented as an art exhibition at the Drawing Center in 2002. Subjects were solicited through an anonymous posting in a local, no longer active paper named The Village Voice. Here we see the ad. At the time I was teaching at the College of New Jersey and posted the ad accordingly. Modular panels were again installed within the exhibition space, and cameras were mounted in discrete positions overhead. Test sequences were performed at the Drawing Center during the museum's off hours. Museum visitors were not present for the experiments. When entering the space, visitors encountered the residue from the experiments, installed modular panels, and the data collected from prior test sequences. The exhibition established a frame of reference for the visitor, in which the visitor was an outside observer of an experimental model. This frame of reference posed a significant problem and a significant question, one which has directed my work since the time of this exhibition, so effectively for the past 20 years. The question became how to create dynamic feedback between the viewer's haptic experience and their habitation of the exhibition space. Much like a living organism, the constant flux of lighting, airflow, and building infrastructure knit together to shape the motion of a museum visitor. In 2016, I set out to explore this dynamic feedback within the context of the Perez Art Museum in Miami. Here we see the plan of the museum's second floor, suggesting a range of possible paths through the building envelope. This undivided processional space, shown here, weaves between discrete boundaries, which were large cast concrete walls. This processional space is flanked by 4 enclosed rooms, 1, 2, 3, 4. Programmed as focus galleries, each of these rooms are defined by a threshold, poured concrete walls, and the presence of a single window. This simple arrangement heightens the visual relay between threshold and window. Neither columns nor contours interrupt the visitor's line of sight within the bounded gallery space. Imagine now that the building is in motion. Boundary planes slide and pivot, much like revolving doors. Pivoting edges operate as switches in a visual field, redirecting sightlines and procession through the space. In developing this project, the studio began at the time to construct a series of mechanical and motorized prototypes to try to understand how specifically these changing occluding edges would behave in the presence of a moving viewer. Specifically, while developing S281913 for the Perez, the studio began to study how a door's rotational axis impacts sightlines. Large mechanized prototypes studied the relationship between a moving viewer and positional change in a reflective plane. Playing with physical models allowed us to reconsider axial position. Orienting the axis at 45 degrees, the rectangular elements rotated from vertical to horizontal. This reorientation of the axis transforms the apparent path of motion from a circle to an ellipse in both elevation and plan. The representational convention of multiple viewing planes naturalized in the 4 viewports of computer-aided drafting systems became an essential conceptual guide and methodological tool in the project's development. The point of view in a representational system became inextricably linked to the point of viewing in processional space. The orientation of objects and the position of bodies developed relationally. At the Perez, the instrument's axis of rotation shifted the visitor's visual field. The museum's iconic lighting grid, seen here in this reflected ceiling plan, is juxtaposed with a view of Biscayne Bay. What appeared to be static is found to move. What appears near is far. What is transparent is opaque. And what is viewed peripherally is now front and center. Visitors were both actuators and viewers. Activation sets in motion unconventional relationships between viewer and viewer, viewer and guard, and viewer and curator. The gesture was extended so that one body responded to another. Multiple bodies now function in tandem as a single sensitive instrument, a kinetic feedback loop of inputs and outputs. The Wexner Center for the Arts proposed a different architectural frame. Alignment is a critical factor in this building's plan. What's shown in this slide here is an image of a section of the Wexner's galleries, and you'll notice a series of staggered columns interrupting the larger open space of the exhibition hall. The building's grid lines act as an indexical registration. Columns, thresholds, and facade elements are frequently aligned along grid lines, enabling a building's inhabitants to orient themselves within a building's matrix. The Wexner Center for the Arts is designed around 2 divergent structural grid lines. Intersections between grid lines result in staggered thresholds and interior columns. Columns punctuate and interrupt the visitor's visual field within each gallery space. Misalignment between column grids obscure common navigational landmarks. S337473 realigned the divergent grids, reorienting the experiential axis of procession along a 45-degree grid in plan. In order to twist the viewer's visual and processional line of approach, S337473 required modifications to the existing site. The ramp wall, shown here, is lowered to allow for sight lines between circulation and this exhibition space. A sheetrock column is constructed, enclosing the two centrally located columns. This central volume is approached on its corner, accentuating passage along either side. Pivoting thresholds are positioned at 45 degrees to the primary axis of precession. Each threshold bridges and marks this passable space, regulating flow between zones. S337473 is first encountered by the visitor as they process upwards towards the entry of the gallery space. Positional change is activated through manual manipulation. Like S281913, S337473 also rotates along a 45-degree axis in elevation. Unlike S281913, rotation around this axis transforms a lintel into a column and back again. Not only does the glass boundary plane rotate around the central axis, but each internal mechanism also rotates around this axis. A detail of the mechanism is shown here in section through the axial center line. In order to align moving parts, the studio constructed multiple reference frames within our digital model. Coordinate systems allowed for rapid translation between the world's vertical axis and each object's primary reference plane. These new reference frames allow us to study the relational transformation of each component through its rotational path. In an ideal world, and in our digital model, the glass element has a constant velocity through a full 360-degree arc of rotation. It moves smoothly. However, and here I think lies a beautiful critical failure of the work, our digital simulations of kinetic behavior were inaccurate. I'd like to take a moment to talk about this critical failure in some detail. I believe it's actually in some ways the subject, the most generative subject of this talk tonight. So what we have here is we have an image taken of a prototyping and kinetic model developed by Ohio State University's Department of Aerospace Engineering. And they basically added a set of sensors to this rotating element to look at how, accelerometers, to look at how the piece, the speed of the piece changed throughout its arc of rotation. It became apparent in our measurements that the work would be imbalanced across the rotational axis if there was any minute fabrication error or eccentricity. When we in fact attach sensors to the artwork, we found that the piece in fact did have plenty of eccentricity, and we needed some way to calibrate our instrument so as to achieve a dynamic equilibrium. To do this, we situated a series of small weights within these black volumes such that we could tune the instrument, slide the weight up and down the length of this thing so that it would find a gentle resting point at a certain position in its arc, which in the end became the ultimate horizontal location. The weights offset the imbalance and return the piece to a state of equilibrium. The transparency of the piece was determined by the position of the glass, the position of the sun, and the position of the camera. It was interesting to begin to tune the instrument using these counterweights embedded in the back of the piece, because it taught me a tremendous amount about how we learn to navigate our environment through sensory input and gestural response. We started to feel the weight of the piece and the shifts in the weight due to the position of the counterweights embedded in these large volumes. Touch became an ever more important source of proprioceptive feedback. This feedback became important not solely in the manipulation of the final work, but in fact in the entire conception of how a work might be modeled, how a work might be developed, how might a model in fact address the possibility of touch. In 2017, shortly after the completion of the work at the Wexner, I noted an extraordinary mechanical system activated by human touch. This discovery has shaped all subsequent work. Buried within a Vandercook letterpress, for those of you printmakers in the audience, is a perpetual motion machine. This simple mechanism serves as a timepiece, a critical phasing element that links the motion of a human gesture in a kinetic chain. The studio began a longitudinal study of this mechanism. An acceleration curve projected along the surface of a cylinder created oscillating motion. In collaboration with Yale University Engineering Department, we made a series of 3D printed screws and finished the screw by turning it on a lathe. Here was our first functional prototype. The 3D print is a black and white composite material. This mechanical device synchronizes the periodicity of linear and rotary motion. The input, driven by a human motor, drives the output of a single oscillating element. How might a single input affect multiple outputs? This was initially achieved and is continuing to be achieved through a simple counterweight system. And how does periodicity and scale affect the range of a gesture and the motion of a viewer? The internal mechanism grew to accommodate a different temporal gesture and a different temporal scale. The input is activated by touch. In order to understand the haptic feedback of the mechanism on the body, prototypes are assembled and tested in the studio. This input, shown here, has two counterbalanced oscillating outputs, both glass boxes. And you'll see that this glass box is sliding up and down through a glass volume that surrounds it. And here you'll notice the enlarged perpetual motion screw. This first prototype was embedded within an exhibition space. The rotary input, shown in white, drives two counterweighted outputs, flanking either side. And you'll notice in this case that this input is embedded within a single wall and bridges three discrete rooms, 1, 2, 3. Also driven by a human motor, the operator of this system is now located behind the wall. The speed of the system is entirely dependent on the acceleration curve projected on the large screw. An identical system was applied to a different exhibition space, a single input and a counterweighted set of outputs. The mechanism, again, is buried within the wall. This is the same system shown from the opposite side. And you'll notice here that a person is standing behind the wall operating the input. And here we have two counterweighted volumes. In this case, they are large pieces of glass. The prototypes have evolved. The axis of rotation was shifted from horizontal to vertical so as to mimic the behavior of a rotary door. Linked elements slide laterally and vertically. Elements start to move in tandem and can be linked across much greater distances. In early 2020, instruments were embedded between the multiple rooms of Kunstmuseum Thun in Switzerland. Multiple instruments worked in tandem to create a greater spatial network. Here, we have 4 inputs shown in solid white, and each input activates a series of outputs, either one output, as in the case of this input, or multiple outputs, as in the case of this input. Sometimes inputs and outputs stack on top of each other, confusing the boundary between each instrument. I would like to start with a focus on these two instruments here to really tease out the questions of their interconnected behavior. When you enter the exhibition, you enter from a long hallway following this path, and you encounter a large oscillating element. You'll see that the inputs in this case are shown as a hatch mark, and the outputs are shown as a solid white band. These two elements are linked. When turning this lower glass volume, you'll see a opaque wall sliding beneath it. This is the input that triggers this behavior, this oscillating output behavior. Museum visitors turn a glass volume and set in motion the lower supporting wall. The upper segment of the wall is not activated by this glass volume. A visitor in a nearby space turns a different input, setting in motion the upper segment of the original wall. This upper segment is activated by a different instrument. Here, you'll notice as this vertical glass volume is turned, not only does the upper wall volume slide here, but this upper volume is also in motion. In this case, there's a complicated relationship to precision, such that precision is no longer limited to perhaps mechanical or geometrical relationships, but it is in fact a temporal relationship of the utmost importance, where the phasing of the elements and their position in relation to one another becomes a critical aspect of choreography. Linked instruments perform as kinetic chains, transferring energy through a relay of mechanical systems shown above as a cable moves, driving the volumes back and forth. As visitors manually activate these instruments, a choreography of spatial change is set in motion. The light levels from the gallery beyond shape the reflected views in these rotating volumes. Louvers interrupt the window spaces in the far gallery, and visitors in other locations in the museum change the position of those louvers, thereby changing the position and the reflectivity of each glass volume. So for example, moving this louver in this far hallway changes, or moving this input in the far hallway changes the louver all the way over here, which is then affected by this moving wall in this fourth room. The instruments are interconnected. Turning the input of one alters the configuration of another. The resulting spatial overlap blurs the boundaries between instruments such that they are no longer discrete. Gradually, visitors become aware of the dynamic changes and learn their component rhythms. That is the end of this.
Hey, Sarah.
Show.
Wow.
Let me just turn on this. Hello.
Hello. Oh my God. So that's the last project you're showing in the presentation?
Yes, that is the most recent manifestation of this system.
Well, I just want you to imagine a room, actually a concert hall with thousands of people clapping.
Exactly. That's where we are right now. We're in this new imaginary situation.
Wow. All at the same time as a kind of musical instrument. They're synchronized, sharing with you, sharing their appreciation of the brilliance of your work.
That's very generous. I have to say, it's interesting to talk about this because I think there's something very critical to having an embodied presence in relation to these works, and that the discussion of them, and in some ways the kind of language that gets built around them, is important, and yet it isn't the same as itself. And so I think that it raises this complicated question about what does it mean to change something at a remove, or to experience something at a remove. And I will actually share my screen again. I want to say something about that problem in the context of this discussion. So let me figure out how to do that. Just one second. So I would like to say, in relation to this resounding applause that you're referring to, that if we just take a look at this slide, that one of the really fascinating challenges of this work is thinking about how we learn our spatial relationship to others. So I don't hear anyone on the other end of this Zoom call except you, Robert. And so I'm in a situation where I'm only, in some ways there's this bizarre remove, and the question is, how do you learn the extent of your own reach? So how do you understand, or learn to understand, that you're affecting something if you can't see it or hear it or feel it somehow?
No, wow, there's so many questions I have. So let's take that one, because it talks about this disembodiment, if pushed to the limit, begins to raise the question about a loss of awareness, and that being seen as a kind of positive attribute. If I were to return to the project, and I won't be able to restate the title of your projects because they have a numerical logic to them that only you know, like deciphering a code. But the Mass MoCA project, well, actually the Wexner project as well, these are columns and beams and levers. They're vector lines that rotate 360 degrees, and they change their identity and their relation to the world, obviously, spatially and aesthetically. But I remember you were showing your simulation videos, and if you take a line and you rotate it, and depending on where the angle of the pivot is placed, the support arm that holds these pieces suspended, you create a phantom geometry. You said, for example, an ellipse. Now, you don't see the ellipse. You feel the ellipse, or based on how attentive you are as a user, occupant, visitor, you might be aware that these are drawing machines as well. And they're drawing a second geometry, and then that second geometry disappears. And my sense is that, well, obviously you're the author of this, so you're aware of this kind of phantom condition, and I was curious that rather than assume that phantom geometry, the ellipse is a resultant of something that has been figured out in a linear process. One could reverse engineer the problem and say that you're going to start with the phantom geometries and then derive the drawing lines, vector pieces, right, that produce them.
So if I'm understanding what you're saying that you would, let's say, trace an imaginary path in space. And you would, maybe I'm misunderstanding what you're saying entirely. You start out with some kind of spatial, a three-dimensional line. And that then you want to occupy that line in time. And that is the kind of inverse engineering of this process.
Yeah, I wasn't, my question isn't so much a design question. I was very moved by the fact that you felt it was important representationally to demarcate the geometric figure that your column beam produces as a temporal inscription. And yet you don't see that in the installation. You feel it, you remember it, you conceptualize it, you dream it. And I was just interested, you know, as maybe as a kind of intellectual exercise, that one could start with the ellipse in space and figure out where the vector line has to move to draw that ellipse.
So what you're saying is fascinating to me, because it's so, because let me try to clarify some procedural issues, which I think are very important. I feel like our tools are always inadequate to any task. And so, and I think this is particularly true when we assume our tools can do everything. So the more we think our tools can do, the more they kind of leave us with big black holes to try to fill in. And I think that that's particularly true for digital models, where we imagine the digital model is showing us the entire behavior of something, but really it's really kind of masking the behavior of things in all sorts of exciting ways. And in some sense, my interest in the uncovery of that ellipse, is that it was a translation of something through so many media that suddenly it was like, oh, well, we ran it through this way of looking at it, and that way of building it, and this way of moving it, and this way of kind of manipulating it, and suddenly there was a logic. So in that sense, it was like this extraordinary discovery that pointed towards some some sense of clarity and simplicity that seemed very important. But I don't know that it would make sense to start with something so simple and undo it, because it would be impossible to understand how. Because in some ways, to make that ellipse, you wouldn't trace the figure, you would find the rotation whereby a geometry occupied that figure. And that is the thing that seems so hard to undo. But it's almost, I guess what I think is interesting in part about your question or your comment is that what I find so marvelous is all of the limitations of our tools, because the limitations of our tools are what teach us things.
Right, right. No, I certainly agree with you. And the most, how should I say, the kind of profound example of that, and you touched upon this, it's almost like when you think of these 18th century clock watchmakers, the exquisite and the enormous ingenuity that goes into that very small space in order to move the second and the minute hand, the hour hand. It's so like insightful, especially to the students who were watching here, that, and we spoke about this earlier, that this extraordinary grace that your projects, your installations are able to achieve in terms of the kind of lightness of being. The choreography is so smooth and so beautifully tuned to a single hand. And yet, in order to achieve that clarity and consistency of repose, one has to invent an entire constellation of technology behind the scenes and in the inner workings of that engine, that will to make it dance, right? And so I applaud you on the highest level. I imagine that there are lectures within lectures, and one lecture you could spend all your time talking about the joint, the pivots, right, the balance, and all of the problems that arise along the way that have to be overcome to reach a relative perfection.
Yes, and there's something very interesting in what you're saying that I'd like to expand on, which I in some ways locate at the history of, in the history of kind of kinetic art production. And it has to do with the machine as an aesthetic object. And I think that in some ways there is a tremendous amount of precision and time and emphasis on the development of the machine, but there is also a very clear choice to not show that machine, and that machine then becomes buried within this sort of, and this kind of mute envelope or the junk space of a gallery system. And I think that becomes a critical, it's critical because it creates an emphasis on your haptic engagement with it, as opposed to an aestheticization of the technical or an aestheticization of the machine. Nonetheless, the machine itself is incredibly important. But rather, or the machine is important as it is a social object, as it is a perceptual object, as it is formative of our experience, as it makes and unmakes our experience. It is not aestheticized in its technical presence. Right. And I think that then makes the labor somehow more strange, because it's not, it's buried, it's not shown.
Right. It's interesting. The latest work, the more recent work, you've you've taken the notion of change, and you have elongated it. That is to say that in many of your pieces, there's either a singularity, that is a single piece moves, or a double piece of a like a sibling that's moving as a pair. And now you've made a concerted effort to introduce a distance, and if the term is correct, a kind of disembodiment, so that it would challenge the user's perception of fully understanding the action and reaction of the twins. Like they may be so far apart that maybe if you turned your head at the right moment, you saw it moved in the corner. I mean, your project is all about, it always works with boundaries, right, and thresholds. And here's another boundary and threshold that you appear to be introducing to try to figure out what you can discover as an artist and share with your audience in the new work around that subject.
Yes, and I think in some ways this idea of a network, of a kinetic chain, is most related to a group of works that I made maybe 10 years ago now that really used the notion of a whole as its kind of organizing principle. So you would have these clusters of spaces, and there would be perforations through those spaces. So the perforation became interesting, the whole became, with an H, became interesting because you would walk through the space and suddenly you would realize there was a place next to you that you hadn't just been in, but you didn't realize really was connected to where you are. So you started to understand through this process of movement, of your own movement and navigation, a larger set of spatial relations that you were inhabiting. And I think that these kinetic chains, or these networks, or these sort of linked instruments, are really playing with the possibility of learning the interconnectedness of space without it being so visual. So it's not about an ocular experience, it's about a different sort of proprioceptive awareness, whereby you're aware of how you touch one thing and you affect something somewhere else. And I think the limit of that awareness is really interesting to me. So how far away does something have to be such that you don't understand you affect it? I mean, you and I are very distant right now, right, in space, but there's a way that we're bringing close somehow, we're collapsing the distance through this interface. And I'm interested in that limitation. And I'm interested in that limitation not so much through a kind of digital screen-based technology, but through a kind of physically present material.
Yeah, it's like no, but there's something beautiful, like you know, these primitive telephones where they're, as a young child,
Yeah.
you have two soup cans that are attached by a string, and it's just wonderfully fantastic that you can talk into that vessel, and if someone puts the ear on the replica of that vessel anywhere between, you know, 3, 5, 10 feet away, you can hear a voice. And it's primitive technology, right? So it's an interesting question, because part of your work, although it's all about perception, there's there's a kind of psychology. You're interested in what messages we receive and how we interpret those messages and what they mean to us, whether they're subjective or there's some notion of a kind of a collective truth, a universal truth that's to be, how should it argued, but at what point does that disembodiment create a certain amount of angst? And it certainly problematizes the control of a single user, because it cascades quite far into the distance and someone else unexpectedly is affected by that. So it beckons the question, might that, and I'm just as a purely conceptual exercise, could that extend indefinitely through a building where you're actually not aware that you're doing something on the third floor that's having an impact at the entry level in the lobby, right? And so you have to go through the entire building to try to reconstruct the cause and effect as a kind of field theory. It's very beautiful. I mean, it sounds like you're opening up really exciting new work.
I think there's tremendous potential, and I also think it raises this question of the possibility of learning collaboration or learning your effect on others. But it also raises this question of what constitutes an architecture. So your discussion about this telephone is, I think, a brilliant reference, because in a way that string is it's a huge amount of space. The cross section of that string is what's transmitting this vibration, which is really all kinetic energy is. All sound is kinetic energy, and kinetic energy is vibration. So you have this tremendous energy passing through this very, very narrow system or narrow space. And I think it's fascinating that that narrow space becomes like the energy transfers into this visual, visible thing, physical, material thing, and then it comes out as a wave. And I just think that's beautiful. And the possibility of us sensing that and sharing that and linking ourselves together through that architecture is a huge space of potential.
Sarah, here's before I'm going to ask a question that came online in a second, but so many of your, well, all of the projects, let's just say they're museums, and you inherit the legacy of the plan, section, and elevation of a museum as a kind of host. And you interrogate it and try to figure out where the proper location is to deploy this second system, right? Which activates and introduces a kind of new intelligence, memory experience inside. There's often a very clear demarcation, although you're brilliant at blurring certain relationships, and especially in the context of your project might be a column next to a column or a plane next to a plane, and yet yours is something fundamentally different as it lives. There is always a clear acknowledgement that, let's say, the floor will remain fixed, the building envelope is to remain static, and your work is to undergo a changing choreography inside to tell us something about the world. At what moment might your work extend and actually challenge the authority of that limit, so that you're both acquiring control over the boundary, the enclosure, as well as the threshold?
Okay, so if I'm understanding, I'm going to try to answer this question, assuming I'm understanding what you're saying. I think it's interesting to imagine the problem of an artwork and its camouflage. So what do I mean by that? I mean that one of the great issues is that a site is never really taken and just represented. So the work isn't just dropped into a location. For every project, the location is massaged, is a kind of one way to think of it. So there are many sort of sleights of hand that make a wall thicker, that change the rhythm of the columns, that bring all of the beams to a matching height, so that there's a way that the building, in fact, isn't the given, but it appears to be the given. And so there's this camouflaging of this move that allows the work, the part of the work that isn't camouflaged, to remain somewhat separate. And I think that I've found that very important, because otherwise let's call it the move, like this kind of strategic shift that is intended is invisible. And I think that making it perceptually evident is really important. And I think that this can be seen even in, and maybe perhaps most clearly, in many of the holes that were made in buildings. Those holes were not cut in the building. Those holes are already there in the building. There's already void space in the building. It's simply a matter of slightly shifting the walls or alternating the cladding such that a hole seems to appear in the building. And it's really a negotiation with a given space. And it's really a game of choosing what to camouflage and what to make visible.
Right. No, that was beautifully said. Maybe another way of stating my question is, can you talk about the scale that you assign your elements, and how to scale? How do you interpret scale as doing a certain form of work, productive work, and if you exceed that scale, something is problematic for you that you're maybe uncomfortable with?
Yes, that's interesting. Okay, absolutely. So I think that it's been very important for the scale of the visible parts of the work, the part that appears, to remain kind of relative to the body, relative to those features of architecture, those tools of architecture, those machines of architecture, such as doors and windows, that are calibrated to a human passage and human manipulation. And one thing that's really fascinating to me, and I'm going to slightly digress, is that these new digital softwares and our new construction technologies have allowed for the scale of things like windows and doors to be absolutely disproportionate with the scale of the human figure. And so now you have, many facades that are however many stories high, and you lose a sense of kind of agency, I think, of the person to the space that they inhabit. And I think part of the reason that's happening is because it's possible. And part of the reason that's happening is because we don't have a sense of the scale of ourselves to the things we design anymore. We've lost that in our machines. But I don't want to lose the strand of your question, because I think it's really important, and I'll try to be concise. I also think that it's very important to differentiate the scale of the total building from the scale of the work, such that it doesn't become invisible.
Right. No, I like that. I'm going to ask you a question from Chris Perry, who you may know, but he's one of our distinguished faculty members in the School of Architecture, and he says, you began with a reference to Gordon Pask and cybernetics, with an interest in how we shape our environment, which in turn shapes us. The work you showed tonight seems relatively linear in terms of its cause and effect relationships, at least in terms of each object's relation to one another. Is there a feedback at work in your systems? And if so, in what ways does that occur?
Okay, that's such a great question, and it's totally accurate. So, well, let me say what is accurate about your question, since it's a question. There are inputs and outputs, and as of now, mechanically, these inputs and outputs are discrete. And there was a period where I was extremely interested in mechanically having inputs and outputs affect one another. So I started to look at mechanisms such as differentials that drive the rear drive of our four-wheel drive cars, that start to extend the possibility of a mutual control of input and output, etc. But one of the things that I realized in the construction of these pieces is that these systems are far more complicated than the mechanical infrastructure, meaning that the inputs and the outputs are not simply about how one mechanical element drives another, but how, in fact, first of all, we perceive the limit of the mechanical system. So, for example, if you have three volumes that are stacked on top of each other, and they're all driven from different locations and different bodies and different people, and they start to overlap and affect them, but the gestalt of them perceptually is that they are one thing. Then you lose that singularity or that singular direction of one thing influencing another thing. And the other thing, or the other important note that I think complicates this mechanical one-way system, which as of now it absolutely is a mechanical one-way system, is that there's a feedback between the active participant in the system and that mechanical output. So if it constricts the position that you can pass, then you can't pass there, and so you move something differently. And each of those things, I think, start to create these relays that are not limited to the kind of construction of the mechanism. And I have one other important note about this, which is a bigger note, and it has to do with design, and network design, which is one of the things that I've been really excited by and challenged by, is that in trying to develop a let's call it a cybernetic system or a feedback loop between elements, you're suddenly taken out of the design of the space. You're really thinking suddenly, or one is imagining inputs and outputs or systems development or systems design, which doesn't correspond with spatial layout. And I think that's been a really exciting outcome and outgrowth of this process.
Great. I'm sure Chris has a follow-up question we haven't seen yet. We have another question, I believe, from a student in the School of Architecture, Amatullah Koz, and she, or he says, I'm sorry, I don't know which gender it is. How difficult is it to have a visual artist career where you have moving installations? And it's followed by the next question. Is it a challenge compared to stationary installation art?
You know, I think that we're in such strange times. One can only sort of have their own, occupy their own subjectivity. I think that opportunities grow out of projects. And so if you realize something and someone sees it and is interested in it, it enables you to realize, if one is lucky, more things. I do think that, you know, it's probably like making a building or being an architect. If you're making a kind of experimental, theoretical studio, if that's your aim, it's likely you will not receive, at least in the near future, these large, well-heeled commissions. But it depends why you're playing the game. And it depends what it means to have a career, and it depends what it means to have creative thought. And I think that the most important question really is, are you able to do the work that you want to do? And I have been very fortunate to be able to do that.
Great answer. Sarah, can you tell us about the role of glass in your work?
Absolutely. So glass sort of fell into my work because I was interested in thinking about, well, I was thinking about holes, and I was thinking about holes as setting up a set of relations between here and there, between one place and another place. And in doing that, all sorts of problems started to arise, including the problem of airflow and body flow, and also the possibility of shifting a hole. So a hole is basically an open space, but a door is an open and closed space. And glass performed this really amazing thing, which was it was transparent, it's reflective, it allowed things to be open and yet still visible, it allowed things to be closed and yet visible, it allowed things to be in flux, and it had the possibility of being simultaneously a reflection and a transparency. So in that way, glass sort of emerged in the work. More specifically, over time, I've been very interested in architectural glass. I think there's a lot of different glass as a material, as you all know, that has many lives. Architectural glass specifically interested in me because I wanted my materials to be industrially produced and to be very mute, to not be craft-based, to not be made by hand. And glass seemed to be a very current and not nostalgic architectural material.
Right. I mean, it's interesting because the idea of time appears in your work in a variety of ways. On one hand, it's the time of the kind of reconfiguration of your architecture in space, but back to the glass, it's interesting. You referenced in tonight's lecture, I think, as well as in previous lectures that I've seen, where you're conscious of light, natural or artificial light, that is a participant and influences one's relation to your installations. And the light in particular cast at certain angles against the glass will modify it from a mirror to the illusion of complete disappearance as void. So it seems to me it's an incredibly loaded material in a project that's really interested in all this kind of simultaneity, ambiguities, and a kind of strange temporal dissonance. And I think the deployment of the glass in the center of the columns and the beams was one of the most extraordinary decisions on your part in the work, because I think it introduced a kind of a level of phenomenal intelligence that would not have been there otherwise for so many reasons and more.
Yeah, and I think that occurs because the center of mass is suddenly a visible void. Like you experience it as a void, even though it actually is a void, the center of mass of that element.
Right. Here's a question I'm returning, I suppose, to both the Mass MoCA project and Wexner, where these column beams, when they rotate, they actually alter one's ability to cross certain spaces. So they assert their presence in such a way that what might have been a kind of open free plan has now been partitioned, or there's a sense of restraint, a limit has been introduced depending on what orientation the element has in space. So it raises this whole question about how the work can move towards a moment of discomfort, inhibition, and even potential danger. you know, whether it's real or imagined. I don't know. I'm curious to talk about that, respond to that issue.
Well, I think that one thing that has emerged since these pieces have started moving is how tension can work. And one way that tension works is when you have things moving very, very close to other things, and there's a kind of tightness between them, like an almost collision or an almost touching. And that almost touching or almost collision in some ways creates a heightened awareness of whatever is happening, if it's happening fast, or if it's happening even better, I would say, if it's happening slowly. And so when things move, let's say at Mass MoCA, when they almost hit the column, when the rotation of the element comes so close to an existing column that it seems like it's going to collide, but it doesn't. Or in Tun, where the element almost extends into the wall and then pulls back at the exact moment just prior to contact. In each of those cases, you become much more sensitized to the limits of your own body in the space and to the movement of the element in the space. And I think it also creates a kind of anxiety, in the best sense of the word, of occupation. So what will happen if, and how does my gesture create a potential collision? And I think that's fabulous. I'm very interested in us becoming
No,
aware.
yeah, I mean, I'm provoked with that comment of your earlier work when you were recording the user's relationship and even authorship over those surfaces. And then there was an index, like a wake, left behind. We were talking earlier about the pieces moving through space, some of them, and producing an ellipse. Well, you know, and I'm reminded of Chris Perry's question about the feedback loop. The work changes in relation to the number of people that are in proximity to it.
Yes, and you know, this to refer back to that, I mean, that work in my mind posed it wasn't successful in what it was trying to do. It confused certain issues quite clearly. And I just want to clarify that. I think at the time, relational aesthetics in the field of art was sort of all the rage. And I felt like the confusion that the experimental model was the artwork, as opposed to the actual kind of like the result of the experiment or the study of how people were engaging with the space. Right. And I think that something really fascinating comes up in terms of control. And this goes back to the cybernetic question by Chris Perry, which is, in those cases, control was entirely top down. It was like a set of plans which were then enacted, and then people responded to the plans. And now suddenly there's a change in how response, like the call and response, evolve, and how people start to not just affect their own situation, but affect the situation of others around them. And that's really interesting to think about the power relations as they filter down through the work over the years.
Absolutely. Here's a question from Robert Woolsey, who you met earlier this evening. And his question is, would occupancy or gesture controls enhance such a space, or is tactile interaction integral to the concept?
Occupancy and gesture controls. Okay, so I just have a question. What are occupancy and gesture controls?
Well, maybe he can type that in quickly. I don't want to speak for him on this. Robert.
I'm just imagining that, you know, you track the user moving through the space, I have a camera that's monitoring them for a gesture, and having that trigger the dynamic interaction, as opposed to them actually, doing it hands-on. So that as you're just walking through the space, it creates this visual dynamic experience. Or is the hands-on, the central point of it? Does that defeat the whole purpose?
Okay, I'm so glad you asked this question, because I've been thinking a lot about this. And one of the things that I've really resisted the use of sensors and kind of linked networks. And I want to say why, and then I want to pose a non-resistant response. So I've been resistant because I believe that the analog allows for this extraordinary haptic kind of and sensory feedback between you and the machine, or you and the instrument, and you and the output-input dynamic of the instrument. It makes a kind of bodily register throughout the kind of linked space. However, I have been collaborating, in fact, on these screws, these what I've referred to as perpetual motion machines, with a brilliant young mechanical engineer who is currently working in a prosthetics lab. And we've been discussing how one might start to think about the digitization of this system. And one of the things we've discussed is what sorts of haptic sensors would need to be engaged such that the contact with something, the touching of something, would affect the outcome. And then to Chris Perry's point, that then the output and input could start to sense one another. And one of the things that has come up, in fact, in the last 24 hours in talking this and teasing this out, is that one of the beauties of the digital is that you wouldn't need to simulate mechanical behavior. And you would, for example, if you think of a prosthetic leg, if you start to swing that leg simply by moving, let's say, a joint, you could have an electric assist whereby that leg would move in a way that you wouldn't, in fact, immediately be able to control. Or if the prosthetic leg was very heavy, you would experience it as very light. And you could program those responses into your system. So I think that to answer your question, Robert, it would be very interesting to play with complex feedback between sensors and linear and nonlinear actuators. However, that dynamic, that kind of learning dynamic, I think really would require extensive prototyping to allow the tactility of it to have some kind of significant resonance.
Right, and you used the word agency before, Sarah, where the occupant feels as though they're participating in the experience, and that there's some kind of dialogue, however surreal that dialogue is. And if the technology were to lose sight of that connection, something significant in your work would be lost, no?
Yes, and the other comment I have about this, in one of my extended hesitations about diving into these sensor-driven systems, has to do with the notion of the black box, which is also an important early idea of cybernetics, where you learn the theory being, to just kind of roughly outline it, you learn the operations of a system, not by understanding how the system works, but simply by a set of input operations, and then the input operations trigger output results. And you study how, by putting input, you get output, and you start to learn the behavior of the machine. And that learning of the behavior of the machine is very, very important. And in that case, if we're dealing with a black box, it doesn't matter what the machine is. The machine could be, you know, a super simple string that you're whispering across, or it could be a really complicated digital signal that passes through multiple satellites to reach its end. All that you really need to have tuned in this case would be the input-output relationship.
Right. Well stated. By the way, to my audience out there in the ether, if you have any questions, feel free to write them down, and we'll ask Sarah. This next question is from Chris Perry again, and he states, your work seems to belong to a history of transdisciplinary practice, such as those of Robert Smithson and other minimalists from the 60s, who challenged traditional categories of art such as painting and sculpture by exchanging methods and techniques between them. And for Smithson, eventually the categories of sculpture, architecture, and landscape. How would you describe your work? Is it sculpture? Is it architecture? And if not quite either, how would you define it?
So, you know, I struggle with this question in some ways. I definitely do not define it as either sculpture or architecture, but because these terms are often sort of bandied about, it's hard to fall outside of them. I think the term that I like least is the term installation, and I just want to clarify why I think that term is problematic. That term, in my mind, invokes work that fills space. And I think that this problem of space as a volume to be filled is really a big one. I think it's a real misconception of how architecture operates. And so in that sense, I'd vastly prefer to be a sculptor or an architect than to be an installation artist.
You know, just to extend that discussion, I suppose every artist has to make a decision about how to title their work. And there's an explicit decision on your part, and I'll let you describe it, but it seems to me that you're trying as best as possible not to bias the interpretation of the work and try to be, as in quotes, as objective as possible with those numerical elements. And so maybe you can both speak about what your position is, not only on the titling of the projects, but your use of language.
So let me say a bit about the titling of the projects, because it has something to do with the earlier question also in the reference to Smithson and a series of post-minimalists, minimalists and post-minimalists. But I'm one of the other things that makes me very anxious about work that is developed in conversation with the built environment, which I would say my work is that it is mistaken as site-specific. And I think that the reason these titles in some ways grow out of an argument that I have with the site-specific. In some ways, I like to imagine space as being generic. It shares qualities. Places have, they could be seen as being kind of poetically differentiable, or they could also be seen as sort of uniform and similar. And I prefer the latter. I like to imagine that spaces have qualities that are very much the same and nameable and classifiable. So the titling system grows out of an idea, or grows out of a simple kind of basically a spreadsheet based on the Dewey Decimal System, where each letter and number relates to the relationship of the work within a larger spatial array. And the assumption or the presumption of this system is that each space is an array. And by that I mean it's a set of bounded locations that are adjacent and or stacked or somehow in contact with one another. And the titles then numerically describe how the work alters those bounded relations. It sounds so abstract, but it's really actually quite simple. And yeah.
No, I like that, but you would agree that all, and that's why it's interesting, because even in the context of crafting the introduction, I was very conscious of the fact that certain terms are loaded, and within different disciplines, they have different associations. So if we go back to the term site specific, you would agree that your pieces calibrate themselves in relation to the specificity of the context. And although the language that you're using and that you've invented has a kind of universal ambition that it could go anywhere in the world, it does attune itself to specific places.
Yes, I think that's absolutely correct. And I'd be very curious, speaking of the disciplinary differences here, to understand what site-specific might mean in the discipline of architecture, or what the resonance of that term is, because I really come at it from a, from an art historical context.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, this is a much longer discussion, but if I had to generalize, you have at one end of the spectrum an architect that takes the position that it's an autonomous object and it's self-referential. Although it has many cultural associations, its emergence into the world is not based on responding one-to-one to its context, its physical context as fabric. Although when it arrives, it may have to undergo some modification to be able to find a reasonable, successful reciprocity. Certainly more radical contemporary projects, something like a Zaha Hadid would fit that category. And there's a critique against that. These are signature projects, Bilbao with Frank Gehry, and there's an argument for and against. And of course, another school of thought would be much more sensitive to the typology and the kind of historical legacies that are embedded within the fabric, and be much more invested maybe in a more subtle dialectical relationship where it's still a contemporary building, but it draws an enormous amount of power from that particular context. Now, again, these are huge generalizations, and there's a lot more, there's a lot larger set of considerations that could be placed on the table here. But my sense is, because I have a number of friends in the art world, that how one is categorized, in which genre they are placed, can for certain artists represent a kind of contested issue for them. How, right? Their reputation. I mean, it's just, it's interesting. We haven't spoken about the kind of business of the art world, or the politics of the art world, or how branding serves to undermine the artist's identity or freedom, and acts in very repressive ways. Or on the contrary, artist takes control. And I'm sure you're far more aware of this than I am.
Well, I think that something that you're saying, there's so much in your comment. Just to start, with this site-specific architecture before we get down the second point. In regards to the site-specific architecture, I'm thinking now of thinkers like Rainer Banham, who are, and many, many others who are thinking about a kind of mechanized architecture, an architecture of systems, an architecture that isn't about the autonomous building, the Zaha Hadid or the Bilbao, but nonetheless are not site-specific. So they're not tuned to the location, but they're a kind of mechanical overlay on a situation. And in that way, and yet they're calibrated to the situation because they have to be, if it's a heating mechanism or an air ventilation mechanism. And so in that sense, they become responsive to and kind of conditioners of existing spaces. But I suppose that's a larger conversation. I think the other thing I just want to touch on in response to your comment is, I think language and how one linguistically defines their practice is of great importance. It's of huge importance because it situates your work in historical relation to other work and thereby makes meaning of your work. And I think that the more, as a maker of things, you can control the language around your work, the more empowered you are to shape its meaning. And I agree, it's definitely a challenge.
And I got to tell you, I mean, through my experience, not every artist is as eloquent and precise with the selection of phrases and words as you are. I mean, it's almost as though you have built a kind of alphabet of terminology that is trying to be as exact and precise in terms of its correlation with your intended meaning in the work. And that's a beautiful thing. It's actually quite rare, quite honestly.
I think it's really important. I think it's really important to assess and to name and to locate your work in a historical argument.
And by the way, I'm gonna move on to a friend of yours in a second who has a wonderful set of observations and a question. But you may not be aware of this, but based on the room that you are presenting your lecture today, it has a beautiful echo chamber, and it's actually quite compelling from an acoustical standpoint. It's like you're in a sonic vessel. Just a note, it works quite well. This one is from Michael Oatman, who you know well, I think. And Michael says, it's a wonderful lecture and dialogue. Sarah, thanks. Your work seems to embody Duchamp's idea that the viewer is at least as important as the artist in producing meaning. I was reminded of two works that seem like ancestors of your work. 11 Rue Larry, a single door that opens between two doorways, closing one as the other is open, or somewhere in between. And The Large Glass, a picture that you could see other viewers through and the world behind it. This was his move away from painting into performance, installation, and even, as he asked, can one make works that are not a work of art? So here's the question. Has Duchamp's questioning of conventions and even architecture informed your thinking in any way? Because as physical as your work is, I'm always drawn back to the existential thoughts.
So Michael, yes, The Large Glass, I think, is the single most important work in my thinking and development as an artist. And I believe that piece, for those of you who are on the other end of this conversation and not speaking, I believe that if you don't know that piece, it's an extraordinary, extraordinary adventure to discover it. And one beautiful problem of that work is the problem of time and the many, 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 many times that are in that piece and that are linked both within the piece and outward towards such a rich sort of cornucopia of other things. And those things are, you know, everything from notes to photographs to documents to works created by other artists, to conversations, to transcriptions. It's just like this extreme wealth of linkages. So it is absolutely critically central. And in terms of glass, it is glass.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah, final question. What advice would you give to the students that are attending this lecture? And many of them are very early in their careers and trying to find their own voice and their own agency and their relation to the world. And the idea of a career is quite far away and abstract. And yet you serve as this kind of extraordinary mentor today and living proof that you can follow your vision and imbue the world with something powerful and meaningful, impactful. So any advice to that wonderful community out there?
So it's a strange question, but I think that there's tremendous pressure right now. People have tremendous pressure to perform for one another, and we imagine ourselves constantly being looked at and assessed by others. And in some ways, I think we short circuit our creative endeavors by imagining what they will look like to others. I think that it's incredibly important to leap into the unknown and to not necessarily share that with others until you're ready, and to allow the development of that work to take time and to happen slowly, and to say it can take a lifetime, and that lifetime will yield what it yields. But the important thing is the pursuit and the sort of slow and, I would say, entirely honed investigation. And so that's my advice. That advice does not fall within a discipline. It does not fall within a career. It does not fall within any of those boundaries. I think it falls within the focus of your own rigorous investigation.
Sarah, thank you. I just, on behalf of the entire school, I want to thank you for sharing your work with us tonight. As I mentioned even before your presentation privately, I have followed it for a number of years, and I think it's authentic. I think it's radical. I think it's beautiful. And there's an infinite set of possibilities still yet to come. And I hope you will stay in touch with Rensselaer School of Architecture, as I mentioned. And I know that Professor Titus, I'm going to put a little pressure on him right now. I know he's online watching. Anthony, I invited Sarah for our awards review. So I already know she's coming back in a different role, and hopefully there's no scheduling conflicts. But it was a tour de force, and I wish you the best throughout your career, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Evan. It's a pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for having me, everyone over there.
Okay.
Bye.
Thank you, Sarah. Have a wonderful night. Be in touch.